One thing I had hoped to do, I didn't have time, is to bring a handout with all of the dates and all of the times of things that I'm going to be quoting. I'm going to probably be hitting somewhere near around 40 different Watchtower magazines as I go through my talk here. But one way that you can see that is if you go to YouTube and you type in Tim Martin and something like Jehovah's Witnesses or Watchtower or Handsome Young Man, something like that, you should be able to find my YouTube channel. And I have a 3-part series called Should You Trust the Watchtower? And a lot of the things that are coming from my talk now are on my YouTube channel under the Should You Trust the Watchtower? And most of it is going to be what I'm going to be talking about today. I do have a few bells and whistles for you that were not on the video, but that's one place that you can see and come up with, find where I've got some of these dates. So my talk today is, Wherefore art thou, faithful slave? What does that make you think of when you hear that phrase, wherefore art thou? Romeo and Juliet, right? That's what I was thinking of. Remember, you get that famous scene where Juliet comes out on the balcony, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? And then Romeo stands up and says, I'm right over here, girlfriend, right? Remember, I'm not good with Elizabethan English, but that's a rough translation of what he said. So Romeo stands up and says, I'm over here. You know, this is one of the few interactive parts of my talk. When Juliet said, wherefore art thou? What was she asking? What was the essence of her question? Why? Any others? Does that sound right? Why? That's right. A lot of people think that her question was where? Where are you, Romeo? Well, I'm over here. No, she didn't go out on the balcony in order to find Romeo. They didn't have a plan to meet. Her question is why? Why does my heart have to belong to Romeo? In the story of Romeo and Juliet, their families were at war together, and these two people fell in love. Why? Why is it Romeo that I have to fall in love with? Out of anybody, my family is at war. My family's going to freak out if they find out we're in love. So, wherefore art thou, faithful slave? We're asking that same question, why? Not in the sense that Juliet did. So basically our question is going to be, why are you the faithful slave? If they were to convince me that there is a faithful slave, the way they define faithful slave, my question is, well then why is it you? Why would you be the faithful slave? Yeah, here we go. Why are you the faithful slave? So if there is a faithful slave, why would it be them? And for us to think about what we should be looking for to find out if they're the faithful slave, let's go to the verse itself. Excellent. Matthew 24:45 to see what it says about the faithful slave. So Matthew 24:45, I have in blue the King James Version, and in the black is the older New World Translation. Who really is the faithful and discreet slave? Or as King James would say, the faithful and wise servant. Who is this faithful and wise servant? At one point, the Watchtower saw it as an individual, Charles Taze Russell. Then they saw it as a class of people. A lot of these things are going to be very basic to some of you. Some of you, this might be new to you, especially those on the internet, possibly. But starting with, who is the faithful and discreet slave? Whom his master appointed over his domestics or his household. So, according to this verse, whoever this is, this faithful slave or wise servant, is appointed over God's household. And they have a very specific task to do. And that task is to give the household their food at the proper time, or meat in due season, according to the King James. So this is what the faithful slave is supposed to do. So if we were going to examine whether the Watchtower had the faithful slave or not, what would we have to do? I think we need to look at the meat in due season that they offered and see, was this timely food? Was this good teaching, is what the Watchtower, how this defines this, the teaching that came at the proper time? Was this something that's trustworthy and reliable? Now, first of all, as I've read old Watchtowers and gone through them, I made a list of the different things that I saw them say what the meat is. And this is what, whoops, 1, 2, there. What is the meat? They've called the meat the Millennial Dawn magazine, the Watchtower magazine, Bible, Message of the Kingdom of the Truth, Christ's Message to the Truth, Church, Unfolding the Bible Truth about the end through God's Spirit. So they've said many different things over the years about what the meat is. But basically you can boil it down into God is giving through his servant timely information and timely teaching that God's people need at the time of the end. And they usually think of this as dates and things in the Bible that are coming true today. And it's also older doctrine as well, like who is Jesus? He is not God like Jehovah God. He's a created being, Michael the Archangel, those things. But it's mainly things that are happening in the end times. Well, the Bible's in there too. I like that, but where do we get all this stuff? It's mainly through Watchtower publications. This is where we get our information. For instance, in this 2013, whoa, am I doing that? Okay, I'm pressing it once and it's going like 3 times. Okay, in the 2013 Watchtower magazine, it says that faithful slave is the channel through which Jesus is feeding his true followers in this time of the end. It's vital that we recognize the faithful slave. Our spiritual health and our relationship with God depend on this channel. Wow, this faithful slave's pretty important, isn't it? So if this is the faithful slave, we need to know it and we need to follow them. But we need to look at this meat and find out, well, is this trustworthy? Well, how about the Bible? It did say that the Bible is a place where you can find the meat. Can we use the Bible? Okay, great. Well, this was the next one that where we ended up on. I was asking the question, well, can we just find the information through the Bible? The 1990 Watchtower magazine says, let us face the fact that no matter how much Bible reading we have done, we would have never have learned the truth on our own. So the Bible is not going to help us. It actually can help cause confusion if you just use the Bible alone, some Watchtower publications will say. So we need the faithful, discreet slave to be able to explain these things. And we have a chart on the next page that shows this. This is a very famous chart. You've seen it all over the place in 1971. You can see how this worked. Jehovah God is up on top, and it's like an organizational chart. And he speaks through Jesus Christ, who then disseminates the information through the faithful, discreet slave. The governing body is encompassed within that faithful, discreet slave. However, early on, the words governing body meant something very different than they do today. In the very beginning, the first time I think governing body was used was in the 1940s, and it just meant the organizational part of the Watchtower that disseminates and prints up the information. It was only the legal entity. It wasn't like the anointed class. It was only part of them that publishes. Then it goes down through the elders, and then through the ministerial servants, and then through the world. This is why the faithful, discreet slave is so important, because it's through the slave that this truth, or this God's truth, that gets passed down to us. And if that's not clear, we have from a Watchtower magazine a little earlier, it said, God interprets and teaches through Christ, the chief servant, who in turn uses the discreet slave as the visible channel, the visible theocratic organization. So this is how God's truth comes down to us today. So how important is the faithful slave? Very important. It's the only place that we can find God's truth. But remember, we need to step back and say, wherefore art thou, faithful slave? Well, why are you the faithful slave? Just because someone stands up and says, I am the authority, we need to ask, well, why are you? Why isn't it someone else? Why isn't it the Pope? Why isn't it Chuck Swindoll? Why isn't it someone else? Then we get this little wrench thrown into work. So far from what we've seen, it looks like they're saying that our information is directly from God. You can rely on it 100%. And then earlier this year, in February, the Watchtower magazine says, the governing body is neither inspired nor infallible. Therefore, it can err in doctrinal matters or organizational direction. Now, this was a very interesting statement because they usually don't say it that clearly, that they can err. We can make errors in doctrine or organizational direction. They use other words, and we're going to see some of that in a little bit. But these things don't line up very well, do they? We get the truth that comes directly from Jehovah God through Jesus Christ, the faithful slave, and through us. But they can err in organizational direction and in doctrine. Well, that's kind of spooky, isn't it? 2011 Watchtower magazine. Interesting statement here. In modern times, there have been refinements in our understanding of certain Bible teachings. This should not trouble us. It should bolster our confidence in the faithful and discreet slave class. When representative members of the slave discern that our viewpoint on some point of truth needs to be clarified or corrected, they do not hold back from making the adjustment. Now, I want to point out a few things here. Refinements. That's the kind of words they usually like to use, not we err in doctrine. Well, so, we need to make refinements, clarifications, as they point out. So if there needs to be clarifications, then they go ahead and do it. But another interesting part of this Watchtower is telling you what your attitude to these changes should be. And what does it say? It shouldn't trouble you. It should bolster your confidence. So when they start changing things, you should go, yes, they're trustworthy. They changed their doctrine. Really? That's what they're trying to push across our minds. Like, okay, we can trust them. They're willing to be humble and say we were wrong on something and change their doctrine when they make their refinements and adjustments and things like that. So, excellent. We're right on key here. We're going to look in God's kingdom rules, and we're going to start looking at some things to see if we can test this idea if they're given meat in due season. In God's kingdom rules, this book is in 2014, so not very long ago, page 50, we find some interesting quotes. Oh, goodness. I don't have these memorized. Here we go. The Bible students spent decades pointing out that the year 1914 would be significant in fulfilling Bible prophecy. Now, let me put this in a timeline here so we can keep track of where they're going. Now, for those of you that were Jehovah's Witnesses at some point, how many of you knew that 1914 was supposed to be significant in Bible prophecy? Yeah, all Jehovah's Witnesses knew that and know that now. However, do they know what was said about it early on? Okay, reading on, possibly reading on. However, at that time, they believed that Christ's presence had begun in 1874. How many here, when you were Jehovah's Witnesses, believed that Christ's presence began in 1874? None of you. How many of you knew that at one time they even taught that? Now, they do admit it. I mean, they're admitting it right here in 2014, but they're admitting it in a way that to say that it's okay that it used to be like this. Reading on further, that he had begun to rule in heaven in 1878, the beginning of Christ's rule, and that the kingdom would not be fully set up until October 1914. Lastly, the harvest would extend from 1874 to 1914 and would culminate in the gathering of the anointed to heaven. So according to this book, written in 214, this was the original timeline given by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. This was the meat and due season that was given to the people back then. But this might look like brand new information to some of you. Well, I've never seen that before, but the people back then supposedly believed that. But they say it's okay. and we'll see this just further on down on page 50. It says, in 1925, a landmark article appeared in the Watchtower entitled Birth of a Nation. It laid out convincing scriptural evidence that the Messianic kingdom had been born in 1914. Very important quote here. I want you to remember this line. The 1925, a landmark article appeared. 1925, a landmark article appeared. Now, the way that you would read this, if you're a Jehovah's Witnesses, is my guess is you would see this timeline that they just drew out for you, and you would think, well, in 1925, it was all cleared up. And in 1925, they would understand the end times the way we would probably do it today. That's how I would think a Jehovah's Witness would think when they would read this. 1925, a landmark article appeared and cleared everything up. Well, we're going to look at that landmark article in a little bit, and we're going to see what it does. It's actually more of a smokescreen than it is anything else. I'm going to actually skip the next two slides. I'm sure you're all familiar with these anyway. Okay. Still back in God's kingdom rules. So they say everything was supposed to be cleared up with that landmark article. There's another interesting page, 20, that I want to show you. There's this picture, which the picture is not that interesting. There's a little caption up on top. Look at what the caption says. It says, in 1914, the Bible students begin to discern the sign of Christ's invisible presence. Well, look at the chart that they just put out for us on page 50. When was Christ's invisible presence? It was 1874. But now they're saying in 1914, the Bible students begin to believe it was in 1914 that Christ's invisible presence. So even within their same book, we're seeing some problems with some dates. Now, the first issue is kind of a smokescreen when they bring up this magazine in 1925. This is just downright deception. These people who wrote this magazine should know better than this, that 1914 they started to discern the invisible presence. And you'll see why here in just a little bit. So let's look at the timeline that was being taught in 1876. In 1876, a guy by the name of Nelson Barber was teaching these dates. He said that the harvest time would be 1874 to 1878. The anointed were supposed to go to heaven in 1878. The Gentile times would end in 1914. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses like to say that, we've been saying that the Gentile times ended in 1914. We've been saying that for a long time. Well, what Nelson Barber meant and what Charles Taze Russell later meant by Gentile times ending means something totally different than Jehovah's Witnesses would say today. For example, in one magazine by Charles Taze Russell, 1880, Watchtower, he says, the kingdom of God will have been broken in pieces and consumed all earthly kingdoms. That's what the Gentile times ending meant for Nelson Barber and for Charles Taze Russell. 1881, the Jews would be restored. Well, Nelson Barber and Charles Taze Russell meet. Charles Taze Russell likes the ideas that Nelson Barber is teaching and joins Barber's movement in 1876. In one of the publications, Millennial Dawn, that Nelson Barber was producing, Charles Taze Russell even helped by pointing out that the pyramids, the measurement of the floor of the pyramids helped demonstrate that 1881 would be the date for the Jews being restored or something like that. So, he was a lot of help to Nelson Barber. But what happened in 1878? Did the anointed go to heaven? No. Nothing happened. So Charles Taze Russell, Nelson Barber split, and Charles Taze Russell takes over, starts the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. 1878, we come up with a new timeline. He has to then readjust his dates. First thing we got to do is we got to move the anointed. Instead of 1878, now they're going to come in 1881. More changes are the wheat and the tares are now separated in 1881. There would be a time of trouble from 74 to 1914. Nominal church, which would be Christendom would be the term that the witnesses would call it today. Then 1878, the nominal church would be cast off in 1871, and then Christ would begin to reign in 1878. But the nominal church is given favor for 3.5 years. They love that number 3.5. They like to throw it in here and there. So if something doesn't happen, well, 3.5 later it's going to happen. So if the nominal church was supposed to be cast off 1878, well, they give them 3.5 years. Now they got till 1881. Well, 1881 comes and goes. People aren't resurrected. People aren't sent to heaven, the anointed class anyway. And now we have a new timeline. First of all, Christ reigns in 1878. We need to find a date for the anointed now. So the anointed go to heaven now in 1914. 1878, Satan is bound. And in 1881, the dead in Christ were raised spiritually. So all of those who were anointed, who died by 1881, they were now raised with spiritual bodies and get to go be with Jehovah God and Jesus in heaven. And the harvest time is now moved from 1874 to 1914. The purpose of the harvest time, by the way, is this is Jehovah God gathering his anointed class together for him to take to heaven. So that's why the harvest time always ends up following when they think the anointed's going to heaven. So what happens in 1914? Nothing, right? They don't go to heaven. They're stuck here. And what do Jehovah's Witnesses say when we point this out, that you predicted the end was going to be in 1914? They say, well, but we admit our mistakes. Oh, really? Well, let's look at this. This is Studies in the Scriptures, Volume 3, and look at the date, 1908, on page 222. This is what it says. That jumped too fast. The deliverance of the saints must take place sometime before 1914 is manifest, since the deliverance of fleshly Israel is appointed to take place at that time. Just how long before 1914 the last living members of the body of Christ will be glorified, we're not directly informed. So this book here, when it's the 1908 version, is clearly saying the end is going to be in 1914. But when the 1937 version comes along, things change. Some words are deleted, and then some words are added. Now look at the difference. That the deliverance of the saints will take place sometime after 1914 is manifest, since the deliverance of flesh, blah, 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 you can read. Totally changed the meaning of their text. So when they say, but we've admitted our mistakes, well, actually, sometimes you cover up your mistakes. They didn't want people to know that 1914 was supposed to be the end. So they don't always admit their mistakes. They changed them. So 1914 comes and goes, nothing happens. They change some of their materials later. How about timeline after 1914? Well, 1918 is now the date. The anointed are supposed to go to heaven. It's the end of the Jewish times of trouble. The harvest time now is from 1878 down to 1918, and there's a 3.5 year of preparation that's given from 1874 to 1878. Now let me explain why this is important to see some of these dates of them saying when the anointed go to heaven and when all of these things are supposed to happen. We're going to look at this book in 1930. This book, the name of it is Light, on pages 46 and 47. On page 46, it's quoting, this is from the Premier of the British Empire. He says, our two flags, talking about the British Empire and the United States, he says, our two flags, wherever the work of God is to be done in this world, will be flying together. So this non-Jehovah's Witness, they're quoting the Premier of the British Empire says this. And then the Watchtower on page 47 gives commentary on this. They say, They have been prophesying particularly since 1918, and their prophecies to date have not come to pass, and that alone is strong evidence that they are false prophets. Now, is the Watchtower brave enough to apply this standard to their own teachings? Holy cow. The premier of the British Empire didn't claim to be a prophet, didn't claim that they were giving God's truth and they are only God's only channel of communication of truth to the world. They just said this, and now they're being judged as false prophets. When you claim to be God's only sole mouthpiece to the world, and you start saying, these are the dates when the anointed are going to heaven, and it doesn't happen, I think that puts you in the category of not giving meat in due season, but spoiled meat to the people. So, after 1918, when 1918 didn't work out, now we've got to come up with a new host of dates. 1925 would be the new date. When 1925 was announced, one of their magazines in 1923 said this: "Our thought is that 1925 is definitely settled by the scriptures." You know, these are people who lived through all these other dates not working. It's settled by the scriptures. As to Noah, the Christian now has more to base his faith than Noah had upon which to base his faith in a coming deluge. I'm telling you, I didn't realize that Noah was on such shaky ground. Did you? Man, is it going to work out or not? God told me to build this ark. I don't know. Well, 1925 didn't work out, but let's look at more of the dates that they went through with 1925. The gleaning work begins in 1918. Jesus enters his temple to judge his people. Harvest time now is from 1874 to 1918. And in 1881, the 144,000 number is fulfilled. There's many different terms for the anointed class. One of them is 144,000. I'm going to give you a bunch of names for the anointed class here in a little while, but there's a fixed number, 144,000, and it was supposed to be filled by 1881, at least in this time period they're giving us. But some of the people of the 144,000 fell away, so now we have to give them a period between 1881 and 1918. We have to give them a time to find more people to fill that number, because it needs to be filled completely. It's a real number. It's not just arbitrary or allegorical. So this brings us now to 1925. What did remember our landmark article say? That in 1925, this landmark article called Birth of a Nation cleared this stuff all up. So what I'm going to show you now is what the 1925 article tells us, what it reads. Okay, first of all, Christ reigns in 1914. The Gentile times end. Satan is cast out of heaven. The anointed patiently await the kingdom. I'm sure that they were patiently awaiting the kingdom. I would have jumped ship by then. Next, 1919, the church flees to the wilderness. Okay, some of these are coming up in a weird order, but in 1918, Satan causes the Watchtower leaders, Rutherford and some of the others, to be imprisoned. And so from 1919 until 1922, the church flees into the wilderness. And of course, this is always spiritual. These people aren't running into the forest somewhere. They spiritually, they kind of retreat because their leaders have been imprisoned. So they retreat to the wilderness. But in 1922, I mean, the Watchtower leaders came out soon afterwards. But in 1922, there was this big campaign, the Cedar Point Convention. Was September 8th, I believe, 1922, this big campaign to advertise the king and his kingdom. And according to this 1925 landmark article, this date, 1922, is biblical. You can find it in your Bible. How many of you, when you were Jehovah's Witnesses, knew that 1922 could be found in your Bible? It's a good thing we have landmark articles to show us that it's there, right? Because it's there, according to them. So what did this landmark article actually do? What we were looking at just before this is when were the anointed supposed to go to heaven? 1925. This article in 1925, all it did was help cover up the idea that they had predicted that 1925 was going to be the end. It gave them a new diagram, a new paradigm for them to look at. So it's a smokescreen. It didn't solve all the problems. It didn't make a timeline that the Jehovah's Witnesses would look at today. Does this look anything like anything you believed when you were Jehovah's Witness? No. Totally different. Moving on through history, they made more interesting changes after 1925. They believe that Christ's invisible presence started in 1914, and Christ started his reign at that point. 1918, Jesus enters temple for judgment. And in 1922, Jehovah pours his spirit out on all nations. They'd like to hold on to some dates, even though they believe something different about them, they'll still hold on to them. And in 1932, Jesus cleanses the temple. This was some of the things they taught after the 1925 article. Now, one interesting thing that pops up is this idea of this Elijah period of the church. It first was taught in, I'm going to throw this date up here, June 6, 1931. This was the first time I saw them talk about this Elijah period of the church. They talk about it a lot through this whole decade of the 30s, and then it starts to peter off and you don't hear about it anymore. So it changes a few months later, and now the Elijah period is 1874 to 1918. Now the purpose of the Elijah period of the church is many descriptions of it I found in the Watchtower books. They say things like, this is the time for Jehovah to see who's teaching Bible truth, or this is the time to find out who's serving God for the right reasons. Some people are serving Jehovah in order to be selfish because they wanted to rule the planet with Jesus. And so they were following God for the wrong reasons, and it was to help to push them out. Now, those that were teaching the truth, they had some of the truth. They realized that we don't have an immortal soul that survives death. The end is coming, but they didn't have all the truth. One of the Watchtower magazines said that one of the errors that they were teaching during the period of the Elijah period was that they were focusing too much on Jesus. That just cracked me up. I like that. Oh man, they were focusing on Jesus too much. They weren't focusing on Jehovah enough. Okay, so a couple years later, Elijah period of the churches moved back to 1914 to 1918. 7 months later, it's moved back up to 1874 to 1918. 13 months later, they move it back to 1978 to 1918. 3 years later, they move it up to 74 to 1914. 3 months later, we're moved back to 78 to 1918. Let me ask you, does this bolster your faith in leaving the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society? Changing dates over and over and over. Well, next I wanted to ask the question of when was the faithful servant selected? So far I'm thinking I don't trust this faithful servant, but when was the faithful servant selected? Remember, the 1914, we read this from God Kingdom Rules, 1914, the Bible students begin to discern the sign of Christ's invisible presence. Well, that wasn't, you know what, I have the wrong question there. That should say, when was Christ's invisible presence begin? I mean, that's an important doctrine there, right? When did Christ's invisible presence start? That's what the question should say. So that's why I have that quote there. That makes sense. So originally, they didn't say 1914. They were saying it was in 1874. They were teaching this up until about 1928. So that's why I say that was just an outright lie when they said in 1914 the Bible students started to discern his invisible presence. They weren't discerning that in 1914. They believed it started in 1874 all the way up until at least 1928. And then the Watchtower started changing his mind. It's mine. About a couple years after this, Christ's invisible presence, 1914. But don't get excited. Even though Jehovah's Witnesses would agree with this today, they didn't stay there. About a year later, they said Christ's invisible presence was in 1918. 4 months later, Christ's invisible presence was back to 1914. Now, all these dates that I'm giving you are the Watchtower magazine. Okay, if I'm quoting anything else, I'll indicate it in the text here. 4 months after this, they go back to 1918. 2 weeks later, they change, and now they're saying 1878 is Christ's invisible presence. 5 months later, they say 1914. 3 months later, back to 1918. 1 month later, they say it's 1874. 2 weeks after that, now it's 1918. 8 years later, in 1941, they were teaching that 1914 was the right date. 2 months later, they change it, and now it's 1918 again. 3 years later, Christ's invisible presence is now found in 1914. Now get this quote. This is from a Watchtower magazine, from the book, Let God Be True. It's not man's food of truth, and no man has given of it. It is Jehovah's truth, which he provides and serves to his people through Christ Jesus. Can you square that with what you just saw on those dates? This is Jehovah's truth. Jehovah can't figure out which date the Christ's invisible presence started. I don't think so. So my next question is, well, who are the faithful, discreet slave? Who is the faithful servant? Now I've got my question on the right slide. So it was first taught from 1874 to about 1895 that the anointed class were the people that would be going to heaven. And as I've looked through all these old Watchtower magazines, I've seen many different terms for the anointed class. The remnant, the flock, the 144,000. I really like the class ones. The bride class, anointed class, servant class, kingdom class, the temple class, the sanctuary class. This is one classy organization, isn't it? Man, there's so much class going on in this. So there's a lot of different terms for the anointed class. In the early days, they didn't call them the anointed class, but I go with that term today because that's what they're comfortable or they know about. Between 1895 and 1925, it was taught that Charles Taze Russell, mainly it was taught that Charles Taze Russell was the faithful, discreet slave. And after 1925, they changed it back to saying, no, it was the anointed class. The anointed class is the faithful, discreet slave. Now, we're going to look at some dates to see when these guys were selected. When was the faithful servant selected? Because at some point, Jehovah God said, you're the faithful slave. So when did that happen? Well, when they believed that it was in the anointed class in 1874, Charles Taze Russell pointed that out in 1980. He said this is when the faithful slave class was selected. A year and a half later, Russell changes this now to 1878. Now there's a big period of silence until after Charles Taze Russell's time, into the 1920s, 1927. Now they're looking back in time. Well, hey, look at that. Oh, well. So in 1927, they said the slave class began in 1918. Now, they're not saying Charles Taze Russell was selected at that time. When they look back in history, now they're just saying it's the anointed class. So all of these dates and all of these quotes, they're saying the anointed class was selected at that time. So they were selected supposedly in 1918, and then a few years later, 1919. 6 months later, back to 1918. 2 years later, 1922. Remember, we like to keep our dates. 13 years later, we say 1919. 6 years later, we jump up to 1879. They were teaching this in 1952. And then, 1919, the slave began and is selected. This is the current view of when the slave was selected. Now, remember, one of the terms for the slave is 144,000. There's this particular number that has to be picked. Look at this. Okay, yeah, let me read this first before I get into that. Shortly after he was installed as king, Jesus put in place a clearly recognizable channel through which he helped his followers be spiritually clean. That channel is the faithful, discreet slave, which Christ appointed in 1919. Really? Is that what history shows? He put in place a clearly recognizable channel. And if I can go back, he did not put in place a clearly recognizable channel. In fact, they were teaching things all over the map into the 1950s. So this isn't accurate at all. This is where it's a downright lie to say that he put in place the clearly recognizable channel in 1919. No, he didn't. At least the people at that time, they didn't recognize it. So now let's get back to where I was starting to go with the 144,000. When was this number full? And whenever the number is full, there's always a period of time where maybe some of them fell away and they can replace that. So we can give them that. Okay, we know that part of their teaching. We heard that earlier. But for now, when did that number get full? The first time that it was full was in 1882. And just like all these other things, some things change. All right, in 1931, they said that the number was full in 1918. 13 months later, they say it was 1914 that the 144,000 was full. A year and a half later, they changed it and said, no, it was 1918. 9 years later, they change and say, it's 1919. 2 years later, they change and say, the 144,000 was full in 1931. That's from the book Let God Be True in 1946. 11 years later, it was 1957. They were teaching it was 1919. And then in 1935, the current view is that it is 1935. That was taught in a 2007 book, and I'm sure many others as well. I can't hit all Watchtowers in one session here. So, again, wherefore art thou, faithful slave? Why would you be the faithful slave? When I look at the history of this organization and how it began, and man, it's like throwing darts at a dartboard. At least for me, I'm not good. They miss it over and over and over. They can't be the faithful slave the way they make things all over the map. Now, there was a controversy at one point about who the faithful slave is, and they addressed it in their magazine. And the controversy was this about the faithful slave. Is it all of the anointed class, or is it just maybe the governing body who publishes? You know, it makes more sense it would be just the governing body, because not all of the anointed class could be the faithful slave, right? See, I'm not ready for this guy. I remember years ago when I lived in Chicago, went to one of their memorial mills, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's once a year, like a communion service, and the only people that get to partake of the elements that are going around, the bread and the wine, the only people that get to partake of it are those who were part of the anointed, part of the 144,000. And one year when we went to this memorial mill, sitting right in front of us, this woman partook of the elements. And I got so excited, I'm like, jabbing my wife, look, but she's one of the anointed class. She's like, would you be quiet? I'm like, but she's going to be she's going to rule from heaven. I mean, wow, that was like so exciting and so cool. But is she part of the faithful, discreet slave? And that was the question which this Watchtower magazine is asking. Is the faithful slave, is it all of the anointed, all of the 144,000, or is it just the governing body? Well, in 1881, remember that date, in 1881, this is how they answered. The objectors may argue that not all of Christ's anointed disciples have a share in preparing the spiritual food, so that perhaps the slave pictures only the leading ones, and the domestics, those they serve in the congregation. So maybe some of the anointed class are the domestics as well, and just the governing body, they're the ones. Well, the answer in this 1981 article is clearly saying no. These are the objectors saying this. The truth is, all 144,000 are part of the faithful slave. That was, though, in 1981. This changed. In 2013 Watchtower, it says, with the subheading, The Faithful and Discreet Slave, it says, today these anointed brothers make up the governing body. And who are the domestics, according to this article? All who are fed, whether they are the anointed or of the other sheep. And that wasn't that long ago that they said that. So they keep changing. Who is the faithful slave? Where did they come from? Why were they selected? What was the date of Christ's invisible presence? I think it's safe to say, why are you the faithful slave? I think that it's safe to say they're not. If you were to convince me that there's the idea of a faithful slave out there, there is no way I could look and say it would be the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, whether it's the governing body, the anointed class, the other sheep, or those not getting resurrected. It's just, the record just does not show that to be true. The only thing that I can take away from this and to provide for people out there and ask you to believe is that they were right on one thing that we looked at very early on when it said, what is the meat? And it listed the Watchtower magazine, the Golden Age, the Millennial Dawn, and all these things. It included the Bible. The Bible did not change through any of those dates. The Bible remained the same. People, when they've gone through an organization like this, the usual thing when they find out the real information about what's going on, find out what the Bible really teaches, find out what's really going on with their history, they just want to dump the whole thing. They become agnostics, they become atheists. That's what usually happens. But I want to urge you to believe that the Bible is still trustworthy. You know, talk to me, talk to a pastor, talk to someone. Thank you. The Bible, inspired by God, is trustworthy up until today. Don't let some people who keep giving you false prophecies blow your belief in God. I urge you to seek someone out. Seek some of the ministries out that are affiliated with the Witnesses for Now Jesus Convention. Talk to a pastor, talk to someone to find out, well, what does the Bible teach on these things? Because the end is going to come. Maybe not in the way that you thought it was. But it's important to know the one who's going to be bringing that end. And you can know him, and you can love him, and follow him. And you don't need an organization that you need to follow. It's good to have Christian friends to fellowship with, but we need to know Jesus and his forgiveness and salvation. And then whatever the end is, we know that we can be there with him. Amen. Thank you.